Hello there. Professor Sam Turner is the Chief Technology Officer at the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and as such is across a whole array of issues related to ensuring UK manufacturing becomes more digital, more sustainable, and more able to access funding from government that will turbocharge the innovation that manufacturers are so good at in this country, but sometimes are not able to capitalise on and take to market. Sam, a warm welcome to you. Let's start with sustainability. COP26 obviously focused manufacturers' minds a great deal. So to what extent do you believe a commitment by manufacturers to becoming net zero is going to be an ever more important feature of doing business across manufacturing supply chains?
Hi, Nick. Yes, thank you. That's a great and timely question, isn't it? I do believe we've seen a real change in the last month or so, really heating up around COP26, but in the last 12 months, certainly a change. Since we started to pick up this agenda at the High Value Manufacturing Catapult over the last few years, there's been a real acceleration. So it is becoming critical. All the larger businesses certainly trying to understand how they deliver their targets in terms of the products, the manufacturing supply chains we're putting out there. And I'd say it's cascading through to mid-tier manufacturers who are trying to understand their role in that value chain. Up to 40% of our UK emissions, the emissions consumed by the UK, as opposed to emitted from the UK, relate to manufacturing, embodied in manufacturing emissions. One of the challenges there is how we measure emissions, embodied emissions, how we procure against them. So we recognise there's a really clear need for standards. So when company A says they've achieved net zero, or they've made 20% inroads into their targets to get to zero emissions, are they measuring apples and pears? Are we all talking about the same things? So we want to start procuring products and services and manufacturing supply chain based upon low emissions technology. We need to be measuring in the same way. So there is a challenge around standards before we get into the innovations, which really excites us about how we can reduce those emissions.
Sam, you spoke then about the imperative coming down from the OEMs and the tier ones and mid-sized companies. Smaller manufacturers, SME manufacturers, should be on notice, and I hope that the last few weeks they have found themselves on notice that this is eventually going to come down to them. Some of them are very quickly getting ahead of the game and becoming shining examples of becoming net zero in process and one day net zero in product. But the only way that the smaller manufacturers can hope to get ahead of this game is to have the technologies to do the measurements that you've just described. Once we've worked out what those measurements are, then they have to have the technologies that enable them to measure those emissions.
That's right. And they've got to be able to measure emissions in their own factory. So you've got the greenhouse gas protocols around scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, scope 1 and scope 2 being controlled, really. That's the activities in the factory and the energy systems that we're using, energy supply. Scope 3 a little more complex when you start to think about particularly the upstream, so the embodied emissions in your own supply chains. But we need the technologies, and that comes down to the sensor technology, the data processing, trusted data. So if we're going to rely on data to determine embodied emissions, which is likely to become a contract winning factor alongside cost, quality and delivery, I expect to see carbon up there. In fact, it will become a qualifier quite soon, but in the short term, it's going to be a winning factor alongside other factors. We've got to have confidence in the way we capture the data and measure it. So looking at how do we capture data, the digital systems, interoperability of systems in a factory environment will all become quite important. And then standard accounting methods. So think about something like the big corporate accounting systems, but for carbon rather than for finances, or platforms that will do both at the same time are going to be crucial. But they're also going to need tools for measuring the carbon in their supply chains. And this is where things like blockchain may come into play. And I'm not trying to scare people to say you need to go find all these solutions now. We need to think about what does your footprint look like? How can you measure and evidence it? And then you can start to look at how you can reduce it. But the first thing is clearly going to be a requirement to report against your emissions footprint as a manufacturer, wherever you sit in that value chain. And if you're ahead of the game in understanding those, and ahead of the game in starting to reduce that footprint, not necessarily straight to zero, but reducing it, then you're going to be on the front foot in terms of winning business and ultimately be rewarded for investing in innovation, the technology, the data measurement that's going to evidence your pathway to zero emissions.
I think we're looking forward in the next couple of years to what is hopefully going to be a sort of mushrooming of innovation in the UK. And I know that the High Value Manufacturing Catapult has been working with a range of bodies to try to find a way through what can sometimes be a thicket of regulations and rules regarding getting government funding for things like innovation, taking a product from design through to commercialization. You've just come off the back of a 2-year study into this. Tell us what the broader problem was that it had to resolve and what the recommendations are.
So one of the overall challenge we've seen, we look at the national challenge we've just talked around the route to net zero and digitalisation and the growth of key sectors. It needs the UK manufacturing industry, innovation, research community to come together to solve some of these. And we found that some of the mechanisms for bringing together academia, innovation organisations like our own Catapult and other Catapults and RTOs and industry are complicated, difficult to navigate, and sometimes make it difficult to work with those multi-parties. You know, you can't afford to fund a Catapult and the university together with industry, or in a research funding activity, there's not money for that higher to activity that brings a Catapult in our industry and to apply the outputs. So a number of the first recommendation we had from a study we've done on here, working with a broader UK research innovation community to look at the challenges, identify where the most impactful interventions would be. We had 5 key recommendations. The first of which is simply to simplify and standardise sets of rules for UKRI and Innovate UK projects in particular, that mean we can bring in, where appropriate, deep expertise from university and the Catapult support in bringing that to fruition for industrial partners. Secondly, we saw the need to provide funding for accelerating translation of research in joint projects between universities and Catapults. So getting better at pulling things quickly from the research domain, world-class research we have on universities, and accelerating that to make it mature, de-risked and available for industry. Thirdly, we saw it was important to invest in people, bridges we call them, working between academia and the innovation ecosystem, Catapults and industry. So people build the relationships, have the ideas and can draw these things through. And then you need the projects ultimately that will mature them through the TRL scale and make them ready for deployment, de-risk those. Fourthly, we recognise that there's a need to run our research council funded work to bring Catapults and other RTOs and industrialists into those projects. So the lower tier research, which is focused on the early stage discovery and science, needs to have room for Catapults in there so we can think about deployment, deployability, manufacturability of the ideas that have been developed. And making sure that we don't have these little gaps between fundamental research, innovation and industry, but it's a seamless transition. And making it easy for industrialists to come and navigate in respect to the maturity of a technology or solution. We can find ways of rapidly pulling things through. And the final recommendation from this study was creating opportunities for larger scale collaborative research and development programs, covering a broad range of technologies, broad range of geographies, I think particularly around some national mission type programs. So how do we have missions in place that will deliver the suite of technologies and standards that will get us to net zero manufacturing emissions, that will deliver maximum value for a hydrogen economy in the UK, carbon capture and storage scale up, for example. So these large collaborative missions around R&D innovation are crucial. And at each point, it should be easier for industry to connect and to rapidly draw things through from academia, through Catapult if necessary, into implementation and value realisation.
I was struck by one particular paragraph in the report, which said that it's important to adapt the funding formula to the project and not the other way round. The implication being at the moment that it's difficult for people applying for Innovate UK grants in particular. They have to sort of massage the project into the funding skeleton rather than the other way around. And that might impede progress or might have impeded progress. It sounds a lot more sensible this way.
That's right, Nick. Absolutely. We'll make it as easy as possible, particularly for industry, to engage and launch these projects with a clear need that makes sense and have mechanisms that can flex to fit, rather than flexing the project scope to the mechanism. So that's a clear recommendation. We're exploring ways and that can be done in more flexible initiatives. And things like the ISCF programs, so things like the Made Smarter Innovation program has a range of mechanisms now with greater flexibility on how you can launch projects. But that's really important, I think. And probably has been a barrier to good ideas landing and for industry particularly, finding a way to bring innovation projects to funding.
And have the recommendations been accepted by government? I mean, is this the way forward now?
They've been well received. Some of these recommendations have actually been referenced there was earlier in the year a House of Lords report on the catapults as a whole, and recognising the need to make it easier to bridge the research innovation landscape, and looking at funding mechanisms, removing caps on having catapults and universities working together, for example. So some of these have been acted upon, and all are certainly being considered. So it's an ongoing discussions around how we can put more things in place to make this easier to basically right-size the projects and the project partners for the innovation need.
Well, Sam, it strikes me that the report makes a lot of sense. I'm guessing that from the point of view of manufacturers, what they now need to know is how best they can take advantage of what looks like it's going to be a much improved landscape.
Yes, thanks, Nick. And crucially, as HVM Catapult, we want to make an easier landing place. You can come to us and we can help to navigate, direct and find the right funding source for the challenge you have, rather than trying to fit your problem into a particular sized box. So we will become an easy landing place and be able to direct you to the support, whether that's within Catapult or without, and find the funding that's needed as an output of this work.
Well, good luck with that, Sam. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Nick. See you soon.
This has been a special report from Manufacturing TV. I'm Nick Peters. Thanks for being with us.